This now is Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat from Delaware. He sits on the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Coons, thanks so much for being with us. The White House says it was Admiral Bradley who ordered the second strike and that it was lawful. How persuaded are you?
I'm not, and I am encouraged that there is bipartisan effort behind getting to the bottom of this. John, I'm the senior Democrat on defense and intelligence appropriations in the U.S. Senate, and I haven't gotten anywhere near the level of briefing and engagement that Congress deserves before Trump sleepwalks us into a war with Venezuela. This incident that was just covered by the Washington Post in recent days suggests that a war crime may have been committed, and I think Secretary Hegseth likely gave the order. I know Admiral Bradley. He's the SOCOM commander. He came up through the ranks. He is decorated, he's experienced, he's seasoned. He was one of the first Americans into Afghanistan after 9/11. I'd be very surprised if he did this on his own without direct support or a command from the Secretary.
The New York Times is reporting a nuanced version of this today, Senator, where it hears from multiple sources. The Times reports that Secretary Hegseth, his initial order was to attack the boat and kill people on the boat, but it didn't give any instructions as to what to do if there were survivors there. It also raises the possibility that the follow-up strike was targeted on the boat itself, not the survivors, which may hold a different weight under military law. How does that impact your view of this?
Well, John, that's why we need a thorough oversight investigation by both Senate Armed Services and House Armed Services. That is a credible alternative characterization of what happened. The larger point is that the American people deserve to know what we're doing in Venezuela. Obviously, Maduro is a bad guy, and exporting drugs to Europe or West Africa, which is predominantly what they're doing, sending cocaine through the Caribbean to Europe through West Africa, is a bad thing. But President Trump has tried to justify this as stopping drug trafficking into the United States that's causing tens of thousands of Americans to overdose every year. That is a tragedy that we should be working together to block, but the majority of that is from fentanyl, and the majority of that is coming from Mexico, things that we are working in a strong bipartisan way to try and reduce and interdict. Just this week, President Trump announced he will pardon the former president of Honduras, who was convicted in an American court of trafficking huge quantities of drugs into the United States. And there's no explanation given for that pardon. I suspect it's because of the lobbyists that he hired. So what is the reason we're engaging in the Southern Caribbean? Why are there more than 15,000 U.S. troops and 10% of our Navy deployed off the coast of Venezuela? The obvious answer to me seems to be regime change. They're trying to move Maduro out of power through pressure or by force. And what I haven't heard, and the American people deserve to hear, is what comes next. When you push out a dictator, it causes chaos. Just look at what happened in Libya and Iraq, both of which ended badly for regional security. And I think we need to hear from the Trump administration and from Secretary Rubio, what on earth are their plans for the stage 2 of this engagement in the Southern Caribbean?
You just brought a lot there, including the proposed pardon of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was the president of Honduras, convicted of helping bring in some 500 tons of cocaine into the United States. In his trial, testimony said that he once said he wanted to stuff drugs up the gringos' noses. So what does this pardon, which hasn't happened yet, but we think is going to, tell you?
That pardon suggests that President Trump has been pardoning people left and right for all sorts of reasons that don't serve Americans' core interests. If President Trump actually wants to send a strong signal to Central and South American heads of states involved in narco trafficking, pardoning one of the most recent grotesque offenders, a man who trafficked 500 tons of cocaine into the United States, is exactly the wrong message. So, as is so often the case here, Trump says one thing and does the other. He says he supports law enforcement and pardons the January 6 rioters who assaulted law enforcement. He says this campaign is about stopping drugs coming into America, and I think we will soon see him pardon the immediate past president of Honduras who trafficked hundreds of tons of cocaine to the United States.
I need to hit refresh on my browser. The pardon has happened, and the former president of Honduras, I'm told, has been released. But your point is well taken. Very quickly, Senator, Secretary Hexeth at one point said he actually was monitoring the strike on this boat via a live feed in Venezuela. What questions does that raise for you?
That raises for me, what were the rules of engagement? Look, Admiral Bradley, a decorated SEAL, knows the rules of war and the terms of engagement. And there's quite a distinct thing between intentionally killing survivors who pose no threat to America or American forces and going after a boat in a way that, frankly, we still haven't seen the legal justification for. So I think if Secretary Hegseth was as directly involved in giving orders and monitoring the situation as you just suggested, that will support the bipartisan outrage at this attack that violates the most basic rules of war.
We'll figure out, or we'll see soon, what Congress finds out. Senator Chris Coons from Delaware, great to see you this morning. Thank you very much. Kate?